Okay, that seems to have bottomed out, so I'm sure people will enjoy it. So, good afternoon, everybody, and good morning for those of you who are joining in the USA. My name's Adrian McConnell. I have the privilege of being the CEO of the CO Research Trust. This is the first lecture in our third lecture series. We've run these series of events for the last 2 years, and they keep growing and getting better. We're very pleased to be doing this third series. We just before we start, a little bit of housekeeping. We'll have our presentations. If you want to make any comments, if you could put them in the chat at the bottom, and what we'll do is we'll ask the questions at the end of both presentations, because we've got quite a lot to get through. So if that's okay. And so really, I could rattle on for ages about this, but I shan't. I'm delighted this afternoon, sorry, to be welcoming Nikki Zellner, who is over in Alabama in the USA, and Professor Nicola Carslaw, who is here in the UK. And the topic of today's lecture is carbon monoxide and air quality in schools. I think this is something that's had increased attention since COVID, and here in the UK, we've had a lot of press around the safety issue around this wrapped concrete and concerns about the actual stability of some of the schools that have been built. So there's been a lot of attention on safety, but perhaps whilst there's been increased attention on air quality in schools, arguably there hasn't been enough. So our first presenter is Nicola Carslaw, who's Professor of Indoor Air Chemistry at the Department of Environment and Geography at the University of York. She's worked in the field of air pollution for around about 30 years. Her research initially focused on outdoor air quality, but since 2005, she specialised in indoor air quality. Along with the group, she studies the indoor air pollution that can arise following cooking and cleaning activities, emissions from buildings and furnishing materials, and breath and skin emissions from people. Finally, she's a member of the UK Department of Health's Committee on the Medical Effects of Air Pollution, COMET, and is a member of the Academy of Fellow of the International Society for Indoor Air Quality and Climate. Thanks for presenting, Nicola. We'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Okay, welcome to this presentation on indoor air pollution. And what I want to cover is where air pollution comes from and how we reduce our exposure to it. So I think the first thing to think about is, why is indoor air quality important? Everybody's heard a lot about outdoor air pollution, but less about indoor air pollution. The reason it's important is because of how much time we spend indoors. So looking at these numbers here, the 79 is the average life expectancy of a US male. It'll be pretty similar for US female or UK male or female, okay? It's a benchmark number. Now, out of those 79 years, it's estimated that we spend about 70 years indoors. So you can already see why this is important. We spend 85 to 90% of our time indoors. Going down to that 50 years, this is estimated to be the average amount of time we spend in our homes, so a very important microenvironment. And within that, it's estimated we spend 26 years in our bedrooms, because about a third of our life is sleep, okay? So again, you can see that that's also important within the homes. And then we have to go all the way down to this 5 years here to get to the amount of time that the average person in a developed country spends outdoors. So despite the fact that a lot of the monitoring work is done outdoors, a lot of the regulation is done outdoors, a lot of the funding around air quality research is certainly focused on outdoors. But you can see that really we need to start thinking about a re-emphasis of where we pay attention. And you have to go all the way down to 4 years here this is the amount of time that is estimated we spend commuting, which is quite depressing, really. And again, these are US figures, but it would probably be fairly similar in the UK. Okay, so let's start to think about why indoor air quality is important now. So one of the reasons, and especially thinking about how things have changed over the last 50 or 60 years or so, is our behaviour has changed. So we spend a lot more time indoors than we used to. So there's a kind of rather stereotypical image here of children playing outdoors in the 50s compared to today, when they might be spending a lot of time on screens. And you can think the same has happened really with jobs. So again, going back, we might have had people working outdoors, farming, for instance. Nowadays, you're much more likely to spend your time in an office. So there's been that shift in behaviour. Over the same time, there's been a shift in the way we build houses. So we've become much more concerned with energy efficiency, for instance, and making our homes more airtight. And this plot here at the bottom shows the average age of houses in a study. And this is plotted against the leakage rate, so how quickly air is leaving those houses. And you can see for the older houses, they're a lot leakier. And that's because as houses have been developed over time, they tend to be made more energy efficient with double glazing, lots of insulation, which is great from an energy point of view, but not so good in terms of how quickly pollutants that we form indoors can make their way outdoors. We've also become much more consumer driven. So we like to buy stuff. And when we buy new stuff, we know that it tends to off-gas chemicals. So you will know, for instance, if you buy a new carpet, quite often you get that smell, which is associated with the adhesive used in the backing of the carpet. And it takes a while before that smell dissipates. So if we've become more consumer driven and we're buying more and more new stuff and bringing it into our homes, which are becoming more airtight, you can see where all of this is going. And then finally, the COVID pandemic has also focused minds around air quality, particularly ventilation, and the importance of really good ventilation in buildings, because obviously that had played a part in transmission of the virus. But it's kind of had lasting effects as well. We've got more people now working at home, at least some days every week. And so that has a knock-on effect on thinking about where exposure to air pollution is happening. And if we look in a typical home, there are lots of sources of indoor air pollution. There are activities like cooking and cleaning, so they're probably pretty obvious: wood stove burning, candle burning. So all of these can generate pollution, and some of them are basically combustion activities. So if you're burning a candle, you've got a naked flame and you're producing similar pollutants to what you could produce in a car engine. It's just another combustion source. Some of them are more subtle, so I've already mentioned furnishing. Houseplants can give off volatile chemicals, which if you think about it, you can smell houseplants quite often. So that means that they're giving off some volatile compounds. You've got things like moisture, and that can become a problem when that moisture can't leave a house. You can get damp and mold, and there's been a lot in the news about that recently. Personal care products are another source of pollution, as can be things like having an integral garage where the fumes from the cars can perhaps get into the house. And then we've also got to think about the impact of outdoors. So if you live near a busy road, then some of those outdoor generated pollutants can find their way into your home. So we spend a lot of time at York thinking about these processes, thinking about the direct emissions from some of these processes, but also the chemistry that can happen once those pollutants are emitted. So when you put all of this together and you start to look at indoor air concentrations, you can find that quite often the indoor concentrations are higher than the outdoor ones, particularly for some of these more volatile species that I've been talking about. And the US EPA have actually estimated that they can be 2 to 5 times higher. So this is all the reasons why we think it's important to study these things. So if you go to the World Health Organization, there's more evidence that we need to think about air pollution. So there's increasing evidence for a number of health effects now, the impact that air pollution can have. Things here such as listed like heart problems, heart disease, cancers, but also even things like dementia now. There's links with air pollution. So this is really important, because if we just focus on outdoor air pollution and reducing that because we want to reduce the risks of some of these health problems, we might be missing part of that exposure that's happening indoors. And it's really important that we consider both the indoor exposure and the outdoor exposure together to understand the kind of full load that someone might be getting from these pollutants. Okay, so let's look in a bit more detail at cooking then. And there's some fundamental facts that we know. So we know, for instance, if you cook with gas, you can produce more pollutants than electric. And hopefully that's pretty obvious. That just comes from the fact you have that flame and you have additional combustion pollutants. So again, just the same as a combustion engine outdoors in a car, you can generate things like nitrogen oxides, particulate matter, hydrocarbons. Now, we also know from lots of work done at York and elsewhere that if you cook meat, you can generate more pollutants than vegetables, particularly particulate matter again. And we also know that frying as a process produces more pollutants than boiling, baking, or steaming, and that some oils are better than others for cooking as well. So some, depending on their flash point, can give off more particulate matter when you use them to fry, for instance. So one of the most simple things you can do to reduce your exposure to pollutants indoors is to switch a gas hob to an induction hob or an electric hob, for instance. Now, there was a study in America in 2018 where they looked at different meals, and they were interested in looking at the particulate matter that was formed. So these are tiny particles, too small to be seen by the naked eye, but lots of implications for health, particularly as they get smaller. So on the y-axis here, we have the total concentrations, and the different colours just represent different size particles. So they're getting smaller as we go from the top to the bottom of these bars. And what they've done here is looked at 5 different meals. So breakfast and stir fry produced the highest concentrations. And even though this was an American study, this was a full English being prepared with bacon and sausages. And basically you can see the impact of frying meat in these two has led to the higher concentrations. Now, the chili and lasagna also involved frying meat, but we noticed, and again, we've noticed this in York as well with studies that we've done, when you add a tin of tomatoes, which you do to chili and lasagna, you kind of dampen down that particle production. So over the meal as a whole, you don't tend to make as many particles. So you can see that the numbers here on this axis are 300, maybe 350 micrograms per meter cubed. And given that I appreciate that won't mean much to a lot of people, just thought I'd put it into context by showing you concentrations on a busy street in London. This is Westminster Elizabeth Bridge. And you can see that the PM 2.5 concentrations, that's this kind of bluey blob here. On a busy street, lots of traffic is around 13. So we're talking about a concentration way down here. So this is obviously an annual mean, so this is a background value there the whole time. And these are obviously focused over the course of a meal. But you can see that some of these concentrations can reach quite high values, certainly for maybe the period of 30 minutes to an hour. And if you have a place where there's lots of cooking going on, maybe in a cafe or restaurant, you could get potentially very high exposures to some of these pollutants. So just to focus in on CO a bit, this is from the same study as those particulate concentrations I was just showing you. And you can see that CO also increases quite significantly during cooking. So we've got the full English breakfast again, a stir fry and a chili con carne. And you can see that every time you cook, that you get this peak in CO concentrations going from background values of about 200 parts per billion up to 2, maybe 2.5 parts per million. And just for context, again, the World Health Organization limit over 24 hours at least is about 3.4. So quite significant concentrations from these cooking activities. But CO and particles aren't the only compounds that are emitted. And this is from a chicken stir fry experiment we did at York. And you can see that not only do you get these concentrations of different compounds when you cook, but they come from different parts of the cooking process. So you can see at the top here, we've got these are all volatile organic compounds, and we can see that some of them are associated with different parts of the cooking process. So these are fragrance chemicals associated with spices. And we noticed that these started to increase in concentration when the spices were being chopped up before the cooking started. These compounds in the middle here, these are long chain alkanes, so lots of carbons and hydrogens. You can see that these increased when we started to heat up the oil. And then ethanol here at the bottom, just to focus in on this one, increased when the vegetables were added. So different foods give rise to different chemical signatures as well. And this is a study, there's very few measurements of CO indoors, and I wanted to try and pull some out given the interest of the audience. And again, this is looking at some average conditions for cooking. So if we just focus on the top plot, this is for CO concentrations in a typical kitchen. And these different bars represent different types of cooking. So the first one is electric cooking only. The next one along is gas cooking, but with an extractor fan on when you cooked. And then this is gas cooking, but extractor fan on half the time, not using the extractor fan very much and never using it. So you can see that the concentration increases as you do more cooking, and particularly without the cooker hood on. So again, concentrations of 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 parts per million. So definitely possible to exceed that World Health Organization limit if you're not using the extractor fan. Okay, so scented candles is another area of interest, and this is a huge market. Lots of these things are sold every year. And there's some interesting articles out around the pandemic time where basically it was noted there were lots of complaints about candles not smelling as nice as they used to. And it turned out this was because people had COVID and had lost their sense of smell. And it's quite an interesting correlation that was noticed in a small research study looking at this. So these have really taken off in the last few years. There's this whole kind of hygge lifestyle thing going on. And again, they can generate quite high concentrations of some pollutants when they're burnt. Now, this study is looking at, it was a chamber study. They're trying to look at the emissions. And again, just to show you carbon monoxide concentrations, admittedly in a small space, but this is just from burning one candle, and you can see that the concentrations can get quite high. And this is over a number of hours if you leave these things burning. So just a couple more examples before I talk about some of the solutions for these things. And this is a really neat study where they looked in a house in America over a typical day, and they're just interested in seeing what could happen, what can you understand from the chemical fingerprints. So what we have here is the time along the x-axis, and we have a couple living in this house, and you can see they get up around 7 o'clock in the morning. First thing they do is turn on the coffee machine, and that's where you get this peak of pyridine. So pyridine can be found in coffee. They then start a little bit of cleaning, and you can see some peaks in ethanol here. And then in the early afternoon, they start to prepare a meal. So they have guests coming around for a party in the evening. So you can see this blue trace here. These are peaks coming from some of the spices they were making a ratatouille. And then the guests arrive early evening. You see a big peak in ethanol. So you can probably all guess what that's from. And then when the guests, this other peak here, this D5, this is personal care products, as is isoprene, associated with things like fragrances. So you can see the guests arrive, they start drinking alcohol, they're off-gassing their personal care products. Then as they leave, they start to clean up, put the dishwasher on, and you get this peak of chloramine here. So really interesting fingerprint of all the activities that are going on in this house. And then looking at that on a bigger scale, these are some experiments that were carried out in a cinema in Germany. And what they did here was they looked at 4 different screenings. So these are 4 different days. And what they did was they set up a monitoring system in a cinema in Germany. So you can see here a picture of the theatre. And then they took the outlet system, so the air coming out of that theatre, and they sampled it. You can see this researcher here with some tubing. So like I said, they did 4 different days, and these are all compounds that are emitted from breath. So carbon dioxide, everybody knows about, also acetone and isoprene. And the really neat thing was that they found that even though they were looking at 4 different screenings, 4 different audiences, different conditions, whatever, they could see that the peaks in these breath emissions were exactly the same time in the film, no matter which showing they looked at. And the reason is that they found that there was a particularly exciting part in the movie. So this is from Hunger Games 2. As a part of the movie where Katniss, the protagonist, is being chased, there's some sort of tension, and literally the whole audience holds its breath. And then when the danger is past, they all breathe out again. And you can actually see this in the traces. And these researchers also did some other studies where they looked at things like whether the genre of the film could affect the emissions. And sure enough, they found that if people were watching a comedy or a horror film or a suspense, there were very different emissions of some of these compounds. So it was a really interesting study. Okay, so indoor air cleaning devices have been talked about as a solution. So, you know, we've got these problems with indoor air quality. Maybe we can't open the windows because we're on a busy road. Let's use air cleaners. Now, the problem with air cleaners is that they are largely unregulated at the moment. Well, in fact, they're completely unregulated. So anyone can put one of these things on the market. The problem with a lot of them is that they tend to be set up to remove things like viruses, like COVID. But during their operation, some of them actually make air pollutants. So there's this tension between biological pollution and chemical pollution. And in fact, you might have seen this fuss where there was a plan to put ozone generating air cleaners in classrooms in Wales, which they didn't last very long, I'm glad to say. And this is why you have to understand the whole problem. You can't just look at one part of the air quality problem. Houseplants, so I'm often asked about houseplants, could they be a solution? Well, the problem with houseplants is that although they might have a minor effect, this is what your house would look like here, bottom right, if you were going to have a major effect on indoor air quality. So in other words, they can't make a practical difference in a normal house. So what can we do? We seem to have missed the slide that I wanted. Just hang on a second. Here we go. So how do we reduce our exposure to air pollution indoors? Well, there's a number of things we can do. The best thing to do is actually to try and remove the pollutant sources. So if you can use maybe personal care products or cleaning products that have fewer fragrances in them, for instance, or use less of them. Increase ventilation rates, so you can open windows usually, but this is sometimes a bit more nuanced. So if you live near to a road, you might have to open a window on the opposite side of the house to the road, or think about opening windows outside of rush hours, for instance. When it comes to cleaning, you can use liquid cleaners, not sprays. So sprays are very efficient at turning cleaning products into aerosols, which are much easier then to breathe in. Beware of claims that products are chemical-free. No product is chemical-free. And also ones that are green or natural and not necessarily cleaner, because they use some of these fragrance compounds. Many of them are natural. Doesn't mean to say they're not chemically reactive. Never mix cleaning products either. And then in terms of cooking, you can use the rings at the back and use a cooker hood. So the cooker hood is much more effective at the back of your hob. So if you've only got a couple of pans on, then you use the back. Make sure that your cooker hood actually vents outside, not just back into the kitchen. Switch to electric or induction if you're changing your kitchen. And try not to fry in oil too often. And if you do, then ventilate. And then tell everybody you know about this talk. So the buzzwords here are education, moderation, and ventilation. And on that, I just want to end with some acknowledgements to my research group. And they are pictured here. You've seen some of the slides they produced from some of their work, and also just the different funders that have helped to fund all of this work. And with that, I will end this presentation, and thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Nicola. That was really, really, really interesting. I feel like I want to drag my cooker out into the garden now and just live on raw juice now and not cook anything. But no, really, really fascinating. Thank you. I've got a couple of questions that I'd like to put to you, but I think in the name of time and the fact that we've got Nikki to hear from as well, I'll ask them after her presentation if that's okay. Just a reminder to anyone who is in the audience, if you do want to ask any questions, do please put them in the chat. And our next presentation comes from Nikki Zellner. Nikki, I met at the recent National CO Awareness Association conference in North Carolina. And you know, her story is a really, really powerful one. Nikki is a school and CO safety activist She's a content strategist, a military spouse, and a mother of 2 boys. In February 2020, Nikki experienced firsthand the impact that gaps in CO safety can have on a community when her children, along with almost 80 other children, were poisoned by carbon monoxide in their daycare building. Following this terrible experience, she fought the law for safer schools in Virginia, and she won. She's recently moved to Alabama, and I believe that she'll be taking on the Alabama state government similarly. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand over the floor to Nikki. Thank you.
In 2020, I sent my children to a 5-star daycare in Virginia Beach, Virginia. We had researched this daycare. It had all of the accreditations, glowing 5-star reviews, and an intruder alarm in case anybody ever tried to come in. There were so many precautions being taken at this daycare. We felt like it was a great place for them to be. At 2:20 p.m., I received a text that said, "Come pick up your children. There's been a gas leak." When I arrived on the scene, there were ambulances, fire trucks, and about 80 children between the ages of 6 weeks and 6 years old shoved into a building, along with 20 caregivers at a pickup point, waiting for parents to come and get them. But they were also being checked by EMTs. And to me, that was interesting because I didn't know exactly what was going on. I didn't know what a gas leak meant in relation to health, in relation to risk. I just knew that it looked like a scary situation, and I wanted to ask more questions about what was happening and be a little bit more informed for what occurred on that day. And so what I found out through FOIA request, as well as through reaching out to the local fire department, was that at around 9 that morning, the first symptoms began to show in the caregivers. This was headaches, this was nausea, this was feeling a little bit under the weather, but because everybody was separated into about 8 classrooms, about 10 to 15 kids per class, no one knew that there were group symptoms going on. And so on that particular day, in a 7,200 square foot building, 80 children between the ages of 6 weeks to 6 years old and close to 20 caregivers were poisoned by carbon monoxide. It hit every room of the building, and its source was a faulty switch on a gas burning furnace. And so what we found out that day was that no one knew that carbon monoxide was leaking into the building because there was no carbon monoxide detection on site. And so these children and these caregivers were exposed for close to 6 hours at high levels of ppm, and were ultimately either treated on scene or treated in hospital using hyperbaric methods and forced oxygen. And some of them were staying overnight due to the issue. So that's where this started for me. This started with asking some questions about an event that happened in my children's life that was, I don't want to say trying to be swept under the rug, but was more than happy to not be discussed on a deeper level. It was more than happy to put shout outs and say thank you to the quick response of first responders, and everybody did what they were supposed to do to get the children out of the building. But where I was most concerned and most shocked as a parent was the fact that none of that actually needed to happen if there was carbon monoxide detection on site. And so I started doing digging. I ended up calling the Virginia State Governor's office, and I was directed to the building code department, which was very weird to me because I didn't understand what building codes had to do with carbon monoxide detection and life safety. But I certainly know now, and what they told me on that day was that the state of Virginia did not require carbon monoxide detection in daycare and school facilities, K through 12, if the building was built before 2015, regardless if there was fuel-fired appliances on site. And so that's really where activism started for me. That was just such a glaring issue to me that I wondered why nobody had ever tried to fix it. And then as I went deeper and had more conversations and did more research, I really understood and came to be aware of how convoluted of a mess it is to try and understand where and when you're protected, who's responsible for that protection, and what the laws are and building codes are around detection in different types of public settings. And so I went down the rabbit hole of daycares, schools, and colleges and universities. And so what I want to talk about in today's presentation is just a little bit about what I learned as the mom of 2 carbon monoxide poisoning survivors in a daycare setting, a commercial daycare setting. So again, a little bit about my path to what I now consider being a subject matter expert on carbon monoxide in schools and a safety activist for school safety as a parent. And so the first thing that I did, in addition to asking questions, once I started getting answers, I realized that this was a lot bigger than me and a lot more stakeholders needed to be involved in the situation. So the first thing that I did as kind of angry mom looking for change was the thing that was most understandable to me, which was creating a change.org petition, where I was asking key leaders in the state of Virginia to require carbon monoxide detection in daycares and schools, since there was currently no requirement for that to happen. So this was bringing the issue to the attention of legislators without actually contacting legislators themselves. Then the next step I took was pitching to the media for investigative coverage. And this ultimately led to 4 front-page news articles being picked up by the national news, being featured on CBS Evening News, about kind of one mom's mission to really uncover what the real situation is. And then I realized that we needed to create change on a bigger level. So not just in this particular school, but in the state of Virginia as a whole. So I partnered with a local delegate. They're only allowed to submit so many requests for legislation in a legislative year. And I happened to be one of the bills that came in front of Virginia legislation in 2020, just 1 year after our incident occurred. And every time, the legislative process in the United States, and Virginia in particular, is a very long and excruciating one. You start in whatever chamber you happen to have originated in. In our case, it was the House of Delegates. So we originated in the House. We had to go through committees within the House and then have a full House vote. That allowed us to be presented to the Senate. And then again, the same thing happens. You go through Senate committees. In our case, it was education and health. And then you make your way through those committees through a series of votes. If you pass all of those committees, you're then brought to the floor for a full vote. If you move forward from there, you get to go to the governor's desk. And we did that. We did that in 1 year, and we were able to get carbon monoxide detection required in the state of Virginia for existing and new structures, regardless of year built and regardless of if a fuel-fired appliance is on site. And so what next, right? What happens next after that? And for me, in all of my conversations, I realized how in the dark not only that the public was, but that legislators were, that administrators of schools were, that teachers were, about the real risk of carbon monoxide happening in their school location. And so during COVID, lots of people were doing lots of things. For me, I was becoming best friends with Google and finding everything that I could about carbon monoxide, having expert conversations, and creating a database that really showed that carbon monoxide in schools was a problem, and not just in Virginia, but nationwide as well. And using that information, I created CO Safe Schools, which can be found at carbonmonoxideinschools.org. And it's really a landing pad for people to have resources so that they can start to have conversations with their teachers, their school administrators, whether that's daycare, K through 12 property, or a college and university. And so the next step for CO Safe Schools after doing Virginia legislation is really to get involved on the national and international level in having a solution to this problem. And the problem to me is very easy to see now that I have the language and now that I have had the conversations and have done the research. And so I want to make it easy for people to be boots on the grounds and have conversations in their local community. And so one of the things that really stuck out to me, and my database is based around press reported incidents. And why I built it around press reported incidents is press reporting is free to access, unlike FOIA requests, which cost a significant amount of money to find freedom of information. The other piece of that is this is what's being shared with the public. And what I wanted to see is what information is being shared, and is it being shared accurately and effectively? And so these are just real headlines from real people. These are just 4 of the incidents that I pulled for you for today's presentation, but know that my incident database currently has 274 incidents of press reported CO poisoning and exposure in US daycares, schools, and colleges, dating back to the early 2000s. So really it's a period of about 20 years. And I know that there are a lot more incidents that have occurred, but again, this is based on press reporting and what I have access to and can find using online search methods. So the database itself is found here, carbonmonoxideinschools.org/victims. And what you can see when you go and peruse this database is what region of the country that these incidents are taking place in, what kind of schools they're taking place in, as well as if there's detection on site. I'll also in the database link to the specific articles, one article in particular that basically shows that this is in fact an event tied to carbon monoxide. And it'll show you how that was reported to the public as well. And so these are the things that we've discovered. And I say we, I really mean me, but I use a collective we. This is what we've discovered as it relates to what the common culprits are on school campuses and daycare and university campuses. HVAC equipment, obviously, always a candidate. Kitchen equipment and grills. Damage and corrosion, that's a big one in these schools that are aging. It's not necessarily combustion itself, it's the fact that the exhaust is able to leak out of the ventilation system. Blocked and disconnected vents, sometimes this is related to human error, sometimes this is related to the fact that an animal has made a nest in the exhaust vent. Improper ventilation is human error. This is where somebody has done something to improperly ventilate a space. But over here on the right, this is where a lot of things that are kind of unique to school poisonings are occurring. Landscaping, gas-powered cleaning devices, construction equipment being used on the roof in a gymnasium, in a hallway, backup gas generators during storms, and then idling vehicles in proximity to air intake vents or main areas where people gather. So those are the key culprits. But what I want to talk about today is some really standout data that I uncovered and just put it in layman's terms, because I am not a scientist. I am a mom. I don't have a college degree, but I am very active in this space. And these are the things that are kind of standing out to me and have me concerned as a parent and a community member that I think you should be concerned about as well. So the first thing that we noticed while compiling all of our data is basically that CO is only happening at certain times of year or in certain kinds of places. So when this first occurred for me and I needed to find more information about CO, it was very hard for me to find anything outside of residential information for the home, as well as any marketing tied to CO being talked about at other times of the year outside of storms and cold weather. And so since CO safety marketing efforts have long tied this issue to those two things, there's a lack of public understanding of when and where they're at risk. The public isn't understanding that they're at risk in a school, and the public isn't understanding that they're just as much at risk in the summer or in the spring or fall as they are in the winter. And so what we identified is that a majority of the incidents happening in U.S. schools in particular were occurring predominantly in southeastern and southern, also known as warm weather states, in public K through 12 facilities, and primarily elementary schools. These are the most aged out schools, and they're in the warmest areas. And so there has not been a lot of communication around the risk of carbon monoxide in those locations. The next thing is in our data, it showed that around 40% of the incidents that were occurring in US schools were actually occurring due to portable or temporary CO producing devices. So when your laws and codes are tied to fixed appliances or installed appliances, you're leaving a tremendous gap for things like construction equipment, generators, gas-powered cleaning floor buffers. Those kinds of things are what are causing up to 40% of the issues in US schools. And right now there is no language tied to that in terms of requiring detection to be on site. So again, it's really important to remember that CO doesn't just have to be from a fixed appliance like a gas burner, a kiln, a gas heating and air system. It can certainly come from some more of those portable sources like transportation and portable equipment. And because of the lack of state and federal laws being uniform across all building types and properties and states, this means that a majority of on-campus buildings throughout the US do not have detection devices because they're not required to. So when these buildings and these building owners are saying, okay, this is what's required by the state, that's what we're going to do, anything else is really left up to their discretion, which means it's not happening and leaving a majority of the schools and properties at risk. The other thing that's happening as well is the misreporting of information. And so in the United States, a lot of the information is based on the initial dispatch call, and that's how it's coded in national databases. But what's actually occurring in the case of CO in schools is it's being coded as a medical emergency. So somebody is passing out, somebody has requested medical assistance on site, and it's not until the fire department gets there that they realize that it's a CO issue. And so the misreporting of information is key here when it comes to thinking about how we report on CO, not just from a journalistic standpoint, but from a database recording standpoint. The other piece that we're finding out, which was kind of astonishing to me, and I didn't really realize the impact that this would have, not just nationally in the United States, but as well as across the world, is that while residential CO incidents typically injure or harm 3 people, and those 3 people are needing emergency services that could certainly result in fatalities, campus CO incidents, meaning a daycare, a school campus, or a college campus or recreational event on site, is actually impacting on average 27 people. That means a majority of the local healthcare facilities would need to care for 27 or more people using oxygen, forced oxygen, hyperbaric chambers, and emergency room and transportation needs. And that's going to be very difficult to do if you are not prepared. And so to relieve stress on the healthcare system, you also have to be thinking about that aspect as to why you want to install detection. Because in reality, if a campus situation, a campus exposure happens where there are mass people exposed, like there were in Allentown, Pennsylvania last year, where 80 children were transported to the hospital because they were exposed at such high levels. That was a mass casualty event that needed multiple healthcare systems to be involved, life flight systems, etc. So the other issue that we run into in schools is that not everybody who needs to understand the language of CO understands the language of CO. And so outside of maintenance teams and possibly school nurses, most of the educators and administrators and faculty who see children on a day-to-day basis are not required to complete any kind of training, and they're not required to understand group symptoms and what they should do in that situation. And so this is one of the things that we want to focus on. We want to focus CO Safe Schools on not only being that conversation starting point, but actually being a space where people can learn, particularly teachers and faculty members can get more involved in accessing training for themselves that help them be more aware in those situations. So these are our recommendations for any community member or school system or safety personnel that's in charge of campuses, that has a stake in local campuses in their community. The first thing that you should be doing is conducting audits of fixed and portable and exterior sources of CO on your campus. This means, who do you have landscaping? Who do you bring in for construction situations? What does your car line idling look like? So not just your fixed appliances, but your portable and exterior sources as well. You should be requiring your school admins, faculty, and support staff to complete CO training. This can be done from the local fire department. This can also be done from a number of certification-based programs that are available online and through school systems. You should be identifying high-risk CO areas and install proper detection in each of those locations. That basically means if you have a fixed source, that is obviously a high-risk area. You are going to want installed carbon monoxide detection in those places. But start to think about where that exhaust can also happen. And so go above and beyond code to make sure that you're ensuring that occupant safety there as it relates to the risk in your own school. Increase inspection and maintenance frequency of all CO producing equipment. After my children were poisoned, they installed plug-in CO alarm stations into the daycare environment. And within a week, the CO alarms were going off again and the school was closed again, even after it had passed inspection by gas teams and first responders. And so, what I really encourage people to do is get active in creating CO safety changes in your own community, especially when you're someone who knows the language and can help translate that language to those who may be impacted. So that's really what I like to say we do here at CO Safe Schools. We translate the science into layman's terms. I'm a concerned mom. I'm an active citizen in making sure that I'm involved in the process of creating change. And if you would like to do that too, you can feel free to visit us at carbonmonoxideinschools.org or follow me on any of the social platforms you see at the bottom. But again, there's lots of great resources. Everything is free for you to access. And I hope that you will take a dip down the rabbit hole in finding out how to make your school CO safe. On February 20th of 2020, I sent my children.
Thank you so much, Nikki. That was a really powerful presentation and really inspiring. The things you're doing to make a difference in your own community, and I think it's a big reminder to us here in the UK that we've a lot to do, in this area in terms of making air quality and safer and reducing CO risk. Professor Carslaw, can I just ask you, you're involved in the Tackling Air Pollution in Schools project. I'm quite conscious I've only got 10 minutes left. It's CAPAS, isn't it?
Yeah.
You wouldn't be able to just tell us a little bit about that? 'Cause I think that's one initiative that we are undertaking that is gathering evidence to improve the air
Yeah.
quality in schools in the UK.
Yep. So that's really looking at all aspects of air quality in and around schools. So that includes indoor and outdoor air quality. So it's a network project. So unfortunately, no huge amounts of money for research, but most of what we do is work together in focus groups where we're looking at things like the evidence base in one group, looking at interventions in another group, how you rank the usefulness of those interventions, for instance. So we've got different groups working on different aspects. So the group I'm in is looking at interventions. So we spent a lot of time talking about air cleaners, which are one of my own particular bugbears. So yeah, I guess we've got about another 10 months left on that project, and I think at the end we'll be starting to produce hopefully some information that will help people. So we're already working in schools, we work closely with pressure groups as well, so just trying to get the information out there. Like Nikki said in her talk, I think a lot of it is about finding the way to communicate what's quite often really complex science to useful forms for the general public.
Yeah, right, brilliant. Thank you. I think it'd be great if when you're in a position to share those findings, if you could share them with us, because certainly we'd like to do our part in engaging with policymakers to try and get some of those changes made. Mark Pung from the NCOAA is asking about whether we have a government incentive in the UK to switch from gas cookers to induction. They have a tax credit of up to $800 in the US. In the UK, I don't believe we do as far as cookers and induction hobs are concerned. We have, incentives to switch boilers to more energy efficient boilers, to switch from gas boilers to heat pumps, but there's nothing around cookers at the moment. Perhaps given what we know, there should be. Sorry, I'm just looking at the questions here. I have a question from one of our trustees, John O'Grady. Nicola, could you describe your own cooking arrangements at home? Do you use the rear plates and the extractor fan and things?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have to admit that I'm vegetarian, so I feel quite smug when I tell everyone it's not a good idea to fry meat. So I think it's just, obviously everyone has to cook. It's just about taking those precautions. So we know that it's something like 75 to 80% of people don't use their extractor fans when they're cooking. Yeah. So, it's again that communication between a design feature. So cooker hoods are designed to take away the pollution from when you cook, yeah, and the moisture, but people don't use them. So why is that? And a lot of people say, well, they're noisy. Or some people find that they just vent straight back into the kitchen. So there's often a mismatch between the technology and the behavior. That's a good example.
Great, thank you. We supported a project at UCL a couple of years ago that looked at this, and they found similar behaviors, and the recommendations there were to open the windows, install mechanical ventilation, etc. Thank you. We've had a question from Phil Dorr. Do you have any data on optimum RH indoors? I'm not sure what RH stands for.
Relative humidity.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, I think I haven't looked at that. I tend to focus on the chemistry. There is information out there. So obviously you don't want it too wet, because that's when you get mold and damp, but also it's not good to have it too dry. So dry atmospheres aren't good either. So you can get people have looked at various studies, things like your eyes get really dry. If you sit on an airplane which are air conditioned, you get that horrible feeling of everything being dry. So I think 30 to 40% is probably more or less optimal, I would say, but it's not my area. So
how's that humidity in Alabama, Nikki?
100% all the time.
Yeah. Nikki, John has asked, in terms of your campaigning, what are your short, medium, and long-term plans, aims, and objectives? I'm just conscious that we've only got 5 minutes, but
could go a long way, can it?
Super.
So I mean, I think, I just kind of stumbled into this. This wasn't a plan for my life by any stretch of the imagination. I just happened to have some very interesting skill sets that supported my efforts in this matter. So my background is in marketing and communication strategy, which lent itself very well to understanding how to pitch the media, how to give presentations, how to package ideas in a way that made sense to the general public, because that's what I did for a living, right? I was just now taking on a new brand in order to do that, and something that was very personal to me. So I think, first and foremost, the biggest thing that I will continue to do is share the story. I think personal stories from survivors, from those who've been impacted, who can share the intricate and intimate details of what exactly happened in their situations and how it's impacted them in the long term, is very, very important. The more survivors, the more it's a very difficult story to share. I think for the first year, I couldn't share it without turning red in the face and crying, right? So getting comfortable sharing the stories, because every time you share that story, someone in the audience listens and acts. So that's what I'll continue to do. After every single presentation I've done, I've had fire departments reach out and wanting the incident data so that they can bring that to their own jurisdictions and have more educated conversations with the public in their school safety trainings that they do. So I'm looking, I think, for midterm and long-term objectives. Obviously, I want to create global change in the school safety space. But I think that's going to take a lot of partnerships. I'm one person at CO Safe Schools. I don't have funding or anything like that, but I have a loud mouth and I'm prone to results. So if you're looking for somebody that can really move the needle, let me share my story. Let's have stronger conversations. And then let's talk about how do we package that in a way that the general public can understand. Because I think the biggest hurdle for me in that first year was communicating that this wasn't just an emotional response. There is data that supports this issue. And so I really had to move from emotional mom to data supported conversations that people can understand. And so that's really what my long-term objective is to be the place to break down what is really difficult for most people to understand. Even looking at Nicola's beautiful charts, like until she explained that Katniss was in a serious situation and the audience held their breath, I could not have read that chart to you, right? So it's breaking it down in understandable language. And I'd love to find people that I can partner with and say, how do these two things marry, and what change can we create because of it?
Well, let's pick that up offline. There are some people that I think I'd really like you to speak to. We've got 2 minutes left now. There's one last question from Daniel Hopkins. Is addressed to Nicola Carslaw. Where in the intervention to control air pollution do you see the role of indoor air quality sensors? Should they be used as a visual indicator or as a monitor feeding into a building buildings management system?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So lots of the people that have come to talk to us in the Tapas network, I've been developing such systems. So I think it's really important. So low-cost sensors are fantastic for giving you an indication of air pollution in buildings. Not always accurate, but often that indication is enough. You can see if things are going up, something's going wrong. But what's been lacking, I think, until quite recently is that interface. So like you're alluding to here, building management system. And some companies now are coming up with amazing interfaces for teachers that are really easy for them to understand. And I think that's the key. So they might not understand what 300 micrograms per meter cubed of pollutant X means, but if there's something that tells them open the window, it's getting stuffy in here, then that's obviously the sort of information they need. So there is a lot of stuff going on around that. Yeah.
Super. Thank you. Okay, well, it's 1 minute to 3, and I know that you have another meeting to get to. There's the Tapas Network website in the chat there. I'll ask Kimberly to include that in the follow-up emails. It just remains for me to thank Professor Carslaw and Nikki Zellner for joining us for their really, really inspiring presentations. Next month, on the 15th of November, we've got Dr. Julie Connolly, who will be, her presentation will be Making Sense of CO Exposure, and she's looking at the lived experience of survivors and understanding the experience of underserved communities. So I hope that when that goes live, you'll join that call. I think it'll be 2 p.m. again. And then finally, we have a save the date notice. It will go out formally in November. Our 2024 conference will be a 2-day event on the 18th and 19th of June in Birmingham. That's Birmingham, UK, unfortunately, Nikki, not Birmingham, Alabama. So we'll be sending more details around that, but I hope that you'll be able to join us when we go live on that. So it's 3 o'clock, so I think we're just kept to time. thank you everybody for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed the lecture, and it will be available on our website once we get to chop it up and get it up on YouTube and then on the website. Have a great afternoon and a great day, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.